Okay, folks, I think in the interest of time, we will just get kicked off. This session is going to be recorded, so if anybody does happen to come late, we will make this recording available on the Farming for a Better Climate website, where you'll be able to get copies of the presentations once they're put up there as well. So hello and welcome to this Farming for a Better Climate webinar. My name's Alec Perry. I'm an agricultural consultant based out of the Southwest here in Ayr. And over December and January, I had the pleasure of facilitating our Farming for a Better Climate Winter Roadshow, which included chats around renewables, the economy, and we also covered fertilizers with our local consultants at the time. We've got a slightly different rundown today. The reason for that being, overwhelmingly, the feedback from the roadshow was that people wanted to hear more about nature conservation and the concepts of high nature value farming. So we're fortunate enough to have Professor Davy McCracken join us tonight, and he'll run through that in just a little bit. Okay, so for anybody tonight who feels that they want to get in touch with myself or has any questions about the webinar, any kind of follow-up, please feel free to use that email address that should be available on your screen. I'm conscious of time tonight, and we have three spectacular speakers lined up. So, John, are you available? Are you there?
Yep.
Fantastic. So John Farquhar, for those of you who don't know John, is one of our renewable specialists, and he joined us on 2 of our 3 meetings during the Winter Roadshow. Correct me if I'm wrong, John, it was Lark, Hall and Stirling you were there with us.
It was, yes.
Fantastic. And Ian Boyd, who was present at our Thainston meeting, he can't be here tonight, but thank you, Ian, for your time as well. John, I'll just I'll transition into the next slide. I'll let people get a look at your email address. If you have any questions, please do follow up with us. But other than that, John, I'll let you share your screen and take it away.
Okay. Good. Let me know, Alex, when it's up on your.
That's it. All good. Yep.
Brilliant. Okay, so, and it's not transitioning. Okay, so I'm going to talk about renewables after incentives, and I guess as a background, the impact of non-renewables on farming is a kind of a context for adoption. So typical energy on farms is in the form of electricity and kerosene. There are diesel, obviously, for fuel, and LPG, but these are the kind of like kerosene and diesel equivalent for emissions. So for every megawatt hour of electricity, we've got about 250 kilos of carbon. And for every 1,000 litres of kerosene, it's about 2.5 tons of carbon. But on an energy basis, so a kilowatt hour basis, they are pretty much the same. For most agricultural sectors, electricity is not the major source of carbon emissions, but for energy intensive ones such as soft fruit, potatoes and dairy, it can form a major source of carbon. There's some old data on potatoes. It's not much data on actually percentage of emissions from energy source. Potatoes data is probably based on older technologies to do the refrigeration. Well, that suggests 20 to 30% of your carbon emissions. Soft fruit, it's 15 to 30, depending on the fruit and where you're located. So it's got an impact as far as your farming enterprise is concerned to do with the carbon you emit. Funding, this is the #1 question we get is, oh, what's the funding like for renewables? Well, unfortunately, at the moment, it's pretty poor. Scotland is a bit better than the rest of the country in some senses. There is an interest-free loan for commercial enterprises, the SME loan, and that's up to 100,000 interest-free loan for not just renewables. It's also for energy reduction measures and energy efficiency measures. There is a Some measures, especially heating, there is a £10,000 cashback. Yeah, it is effectively a grant. You don't pay it back. They just don't seem to want to call anything a grant anymore. So renewable heating, ground source heat pumps and heat pumps, they're eligible. Most electricity generation is not eligible for the cashback. It is eligible for the loan, but not the cashback. And at the home level for the farmhouse, if it's not on the business side, there is an equivalent domestic one, which is a £10,000 loan. And again, up to about 75% cashback. So it's very good. But again, it's biased towards heating rather than electrical generation. The RHI for heating, that's closed for new projects. There are some opportunities to expand existing systems, but that's quite limited. For electricity, the only one that's kind of open is, it was open as a contract for difference, but that's only for large projects, really, not at farm scale. For renewable obligation, the ROCs, that closed 3 years ago now, and feed-in tariff likewise closed about 3 years ago. So unfortunately, the funding doesn't look great. However, financially, it can be viable. For electricity, we're talking about farm scale here, really not kind of like developing a project for major exports. It's likely to be viable where the generation is largely used for on-site demand. So it's you're offsetting expensive 20 to 40 to 60p a kilowatt hour purchase grid electricity. So also high yielding sites, which when it comes to wind more than sun, solar is fairly even as long as it's facing the right way. And low construction costs. And the construction costs pretty much refer to the grid connection. It's very variable across the country, and you might be in an area where it's quite easy to connect, other areas it's nigh impossible. Yes, the connection costs have to be low enough. And the paybacks. So yeah, this is referring to, there is a scenario where if your installation and connection costs are low enough, often with solar PV, that's going to be quite low at smaller scale. You can get a payback based purely on the wholesale electricity price, so without using a significant amount on site, but the connection has to be a low enough cost for that. There are interest from developers for large scale sites, solar and wind, generally around 5 to 10 megawatts, and it's good access to the grid. If you're in one of these, if you're lucky enough to be in one of these places, then it's probably already been approached by developers. They know where the grid is cheapest to connect to, but you don't necessarily need to provide all the area yourself. They're happy for a group of close farms to each have a small amount of land. Going rate for solar farms is around about £800 to £1,000 an acre for solar, and about £5,000 per megawatt installed per year. In context, most of the big turbines now are around about 1 to 4 megawatts on the large scale projects and bigger. So, continuing with electricity, and the farm scale, solar PV is the simplest, and in some areas the only option to get planning and consent and approvals. It's wind is one of the hardest to get planning permission for, but it is usually the quickest payback of all the renewables. Hydro can beat it, but the consents are quite difficult. Not difficult to get, but there's a lot of impact assessments and things you need to jump through to get hydro done. But hydro is always financially good. It's just very limited areas you can install it. Below 50 kilowatts on a 3-phase site, it's generally, I say generally, depending on the country, it's more straightforward. I'm comparing it to connecting like a megawatt or 500, it's very difficult then. You can stay below 50 kilowatt. It is also lower cost to do with the fixed fees. So projects around that, especially solar projects, there's a lot of people looking at those roof mounted systems on sheds because they can have fairly good payback and they are not too difficult to sort out from the grid connection point of view, especially if you can use most of it on site. Storage. So if you're generating electricity, it's the landscape has changed very much for this. Before the kind of significant increases in electricity prices, it's rarely been viable at farm scale. It's just generally done at a very large grid scale. But the high energy prices at the moment have changed that. Again, the best viability is connecting up to your own renewables if you don't have a good export contract. It can be, you could be locked into still an export contract that's got quite a long time to run, that's paying, let's say, still paying 5 to 6p. Also, sites that have a bit large daytime usage. Some people are using it to buy cheap night rate electricity and to use it during the day on things like cold stores and chilling, which is generally higher usage during the day. But if you've got storage, there are additional incomes to consider, because once you've got storage, you can actually sell that as a service in the right circumstances. These are called grid balancing services. At the moment, it's quite difficult to get into, and the incomes are not great. But as electricity structures are transforming over the next few years, the local DNOs rather than national grid take control of it. That's SSE if you're in the north, and the country, and Scottish Power if you're in the south. And if they're taking control of them locally, it could open up a wider range of services to smaller storage systems. Things such as just short-term reserves and frequency response, they're quite good incomes if you have a battery. The technology around storage, the lowest capital cost is lead acid. Typically, it's a higher lifetime cost, but at the moment, not necessarily, because lithium-based technologies are quite high at the moment. But it depends on the deal you can get. Certainly, if you're going to go towards Tesla or something like that, it's going to be hard to stack up. Well, they're very hard to get a hold of. But the lithium, you do need to trust the technology, because a low-quality lithium battery is just not going to last long enough to justify the costs. Lead acid has a big advantage that it does work in low temperatures, so it's outside storage indoors north of Scotland. The lithium, you'd have to heat the building basically, which sometimes not a problem if it's a containerized system, but other times it could be a problem. So yeah, lithium is it's a higher capital cost, but it's a lower lifetime cost because they last longer. So lead acids typically last 3 years, let's say, and lithium is expected to last about 5 years. That sort of period. It all depends on how they're used, and then what they're connected to. There is a kind of a newer, it's not a new technology, but newer technology to be commercialized, and that's flow batteries. And these are basically, they don't suit sites with restricted space, but on farms, typically you're not restricted for space, but they move the electrolyte rather than electrolyte fixed. So the flow batteries, they generally rely on a metal called vanadium, which has it's more abundant element than lithium, so it should be theoretically cheaper. However, a big chunk of it, currently the prices has gone up for vanadium because a big chunk of it sits in Russia. But it's still, even the stuff that sits outside of Russia, there's a higher availability than lithium, so is expected to take off as a technology. It's certainly something I'd be keeping an eye on if I was looking at storage at a farm scale. Hydrogen capital is very high, and small scale especially so. lots of the companies that are developing this or produce this technology are looking more, usually a bit larger than farm scale, so 500-600 kilowatts and upwards. And it should be pointed out, to run a 500 or 600 kilowatt electrolyzer, you need to have about a megawatt or more of generation. So to make it viable, or even 2 or 3 megawatts. It is, however, can store an awful large amount of energy very easily. Batteries are limited. You have to have a lot of batteries to store the electricity. Hydrogen can store almost an unlimited amount compared to the generation. But it is, at the moment, the capital is a bit too high to justify it. Renewable heat. So the electricity prices get the headlines. But for residential customers, heating is probably one of the biggest increases, percentage-wise. And as part of your bill, we spend a lot more on heating generally than we do electricity in the domestic scale. So most renewable heating needs a fuel or energy, so biomass, biogas, or electricity. Therefore, the fuel costs need to be factored in. And similar to kind of all the other energy prices, the fuels for these systems has increased, especially processed fuels such as pellets. So we are in a kind of a strange situation at the moment where heating oil is one of the cheapest fuels for heating around. So heating oil, it's roughly about 90 pence a litre at the moment, depending where you are. And that equates to about 9 to 11p kilowatt hour, depending on the efficiency of the boiler. Pellets are around about 8 to 12, so they're similar. But the systems to burn them are a lot more expensive than an oil. Oil and wood chips, still, if it's about £200 a tonne, but it does vary with availability in the seasons, but it's come down a bit recently. That's about 5 to 6p. So mains gas prices is usually north of 10 to 15p, depending on who you are. So we have this weird situation where oil is one of the cheapest. So the savings aren't really significant as much, or aren't as significant as they used to be for the renewables. And so without incentives, you need to consider whether you can make up the difference on your capital costs. It does need to be looked at if it's just financial reasons you are thinking about it. There's plenty of other reasons you could be thinking of adopting it just for carbon or other reasons, but on a pure economic scale, renewable heat is a tricky one at the moment. Heat pumps. So these are classed as renewable, but they use electricity, less than if you were using electricity directly to run a radiator or something. So air source heat pumps in Scotland, they will use about 0.3 to 0.5 units of electricity for every kilowatt of heat. And water source will use quite a lot less than that because they're more efficient in the winter months, especially in Scotland. They will use about 0.2 to 0.3 units. So with an electrical price of 34p for domestic, and let's say 21p or probably more for commercial, the actual heating comes in pretty expensive. So 10 to 17 pence per kilowatt hour for domestic customers, or 6 to 10 pence for commercial customers, depending on what you're paying for your electricity. And it's, even for ground and water source, it's 7 to 10 pence for domestic customers and up to 6p for commercial. So if it's electricity from your own renewables, then these costs obviously drop dramatically because you're generally not, the value of your electricity isn't as high as you purchased, but still needs to be considered at the moment that the cost of electricity is making these financially difficult. I think that's the end of that's the end of my presentation. So I shall hand back to Alex.
Thanks very much, John. That's great. Just bear with me 1 second. So thank you very much, John. We do have a couple of questions come in. Just to reiterate, we've pre-selected some questions for the purposes of tonight, just in the interest of time. But any of the questions that are put in the Q&A, we'll try and get answers back to the participants who've asked it. John, the question that we did select for tonight that we thought was particularly interesting, before we move on to Andrew, was there's obviously been a lot of interest in renewable energy generation in the broader context of the Ukraine crisis and the war in Eastern Europe. Do you think coming into the summer now, there's going to be less enthusiasm around the topic of renewables? Do you think that the renewables topic will fade away again for a spell?
I'm not sure. I think in the news, possibly, because domestic customers will have less of an effect on most people, because most of the energy we use is in the winter in a house. Commercial customers and farms that use electricity, quite a lot of them increases. So refrigeration, it depends on if your cold stores are running into the summer months, but dairy, soft fruits, they're all summer loads. So I would say, I think maybe from the news, but probably not from a farming business that has concerns about energy, it will continue into the summer. Equally, also their fuels, their transport fuels, they're not changing price, and they will increase over most farms over the summer. So I don't think it's going to drop out of the farming community's mind as quickly as it does the news regarding domestic kind of customers.
Brilliant, fair enough. No, thank you very much, John. That's great. Andrew, are you there?
Yes, good evening.
Hello, Andrew. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thanks.
Good, good. For those of you who haven't met Andrew before, Andrew Coalter is the manager of our office at SAC in Perth, and he joined us for all three of the Winter Roadshow meetings. Andrew, do you have any reflections before you get kicked off? How did you find the roadshow?
Yeah, I found them a really good experience. Actually, we were speaking to farmers across from a variety of geographical areas in Scotland, but actually they were coming to us with a lot of the same concerns and questions, particularly questions around the impact of carbon and high value nature farming that we're going to be talking about later. But actually, I'm going to be here talking about the effects of the economy at the moment on Scottish agriculture, and actually a lot of the concerns are the same across the country as well. So a lot of people are on the same page with the sort of things that we're talking about tonight.
Do you know, one of the interesting things, I was recording a podcast the other day, and one of my speakers came away with this line, and it was something along the lines of, you can't go green while you're in the red. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but it does bear true in a lot of instances.
No, that's quite good. I've not heard that one. That's quite good. I'll use that in the future.
Right, Andrew, I'll let you crack on.
Okay, that's great. I'll share my screen. You can let me know once you see it. Is that working okay?
Brilliant, that's it.
Great. Okay, so good evening, everybody. As already said, my name is Andrew Coalter. I'm actually a chartered accountant by training. I've experience of working with agricultural businesses, particularly in the Central Belt and in Fife. I'm now a senior agricultural consultant with SAC in Perth, where actually finance still forms a large part of what I do. So this evening, I'll be giving you some high-level summaries, really, of the economy and what impact that has on Scottish agriculture at the moment. So before I do that, I want to firstly touch on the global economy and its outlook. So there are really a number of key factors in the global outlook that have put pressure on prices, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months. One key point to come out of that is pandemic recovery, which we're still seeing signs of. After coming out of such a long period of stagnation and regression, that's left a lot of economies around the world much weaker. And secondly is the war in Ukraine. In particular, that's had a significant impact on the price of energy, with a particular uplift in the price of gas. That in turn is driving up everything from the price of fuel to fertilizer for farmers, and actually just prices for consumers, such as food shopping. It should be noted that wholesale energy prices have fallen quite significantly over the last couple of months, but domestic inflationary pressures have been firmer than expected. Another point to note is inflation rates across Europe. We'll all be aware of its impact within the UK, but it's important to note that we're not alone in this. So I've got a chart here on the screen which outlines the path of consumer price index inflation rates across Europe for the past 12 months. There's figures on the screen for February 23, but the confirmed figures aren't out for another week or so. So those in the graph for February 23 are all estimates at this stage. But just to point out, inflation really peaked in October 22 in both the UK and across Europe. We are seeing a slow decrease, but this will take time. It is expected to return to about 3% by the end of this year and towards 1% at some point next year. However, that remains to be seen. There is one outlier you can see in that graph, which is France. Their inflation has until now has really been about half of the OECD average. That's largely due to their government capping energy prices. And actually, if the problem of energy inflation is stripped out from many of the other economies within Europe, inflation would have been similar. However, that's been quite an expensive government policy, costing about 3.5% of their GDP, but it's just there for interest really as much as anything else. Low inflation rates that we're starting to see now don't mean that general prices will fall back to normal. We would need negative inflation for that, but it does mean the continued price increases will be curbed significantly. Finally, here I wanted to touch on global interest rates. So as inflation runs high, many countries are increasing interest rates to help curb the inflation and keep it within the general target of 2% for many countries. Increasing interest rates discourages spending and therefore encourages savings, which in turn helps reduce price pressures that lead to inflation. So for reference, the European Central Bank have made a number of raises over the past number of months and sitting at 2.5% since December. The US Federal Reserve has also acted in a similar way with their interest rate sitting from 4.5% to 4.75%. For farming businesses, this will directly impact any unsecured lending and increase finance costs. It might be a good time to consider what financing arrangements are in place for your own business at the moment and what could be done. There are not many cheap options at the moment, but actually it's just important to be aware of your options. So looking now at the UK outlook, starting with inflation, it did reach 11.1% in the 12 months to October 22. It has now pulled back quite a bit from this, and the worst is expected to be over. So the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is calculated by taking a look at the price of a range of goods and services and their changes over a 12-month period. It is expected to pull back within the UK to about 3 or 4% by about this time next year, and still reducing from that point. Separately for agriculture, though, we do need to consider the impact of ag inflation. So overall, the price index for agricultural outputs tends to be more volatile than that for agricultural inputs. So your input costs have seen very strong price rises throughout 2021 and through the first half of 2022, but those prices have started to stabilize in recent months. Agricultural output prices have seen a period of fluctuation in recent months, following a period of very strong inflation. And that can be seen on the graph on the screen, with the lighter line, the cost of inputs, and the darker line, outputs as well. So taking the figures that we have at the moment in the 12 months to December 22, outputs rose by 18.7% in UK agriculture. So within that, there were a couple of key players, milk being one of them, with price increases of around 50%, wheat at around 23%, and pigs around 40 to 43%. There was very little movement on things like eggs and potatoes, and there was actually a slight reverse on sheep and some crops like oilseed rape as well. Input costs, however, have risen by more. They have risen by 20.9% in the 12 months to December 22. A few big players here that are no surprise. So animal feeds going up by about 30%, fertilizer going up by 36% in that 12-month period, and energy and lubricants going up about 45% as well. Interest rates within the UK are currently at 4%. The next meeting of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee is on the 23rd of March, where it looks likely that the interest rate is going to go up again. I'll touch on that later in my presentation, but it looks like rates are going to likely hit about 4.5% in the coming months before settling around 3% in the medium term. It's still well below rates seen from post-war to about 2008, but it does mean that era of cheap money appears to be over for the foreseeable. It has been a good year for many farmers. We've seen increased output prices using inputs that were purchased before prices went up. In particular, this applies to quite a few arable farmers who had forward-bought fertilizer. It does, however, mean that the impact of this ag inflation is perhaps more acutely felt by the industry over the next 12 months. Finally, just a point there in changing agricultural policy in Scotland, there's still some uncertainty here, and we've had the agricultural bill consultation in recent months, more information starting to appear. However, I'm not going to really touch on that much in this presentation as the impact on finances are still a bit loose in detail there. I wanted to take some time to highlight some key points of government policy over the past number of months. It's been a turbulent time in UK politics. So in the last calendar year, we had 3 prime ministers and 4 chancellors of the Exchequer. Since that mini budget, which seems a long time ago now in September, and its subsequent fallout, the UK government has now taken a much more conservative approach to taxation. Before I do get on to talk too much about it, I do want to caveat this with the fact that the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is going to unveil his spring budget this Wednesday, the 15th of March. There's a few things to watch out for in that this week. I suppose the first thing to note is short-term growth forecasts are likely to be slightly better than previously expected. In the medium term, growth forecasts are still quite slow. That's partly based on productivity forecasts and also the number of people in work as well. Still significant pressure on energy bills, which I will touch on again. Public sector pay, that's another thing which is having quite a big impact and will feature in the budget too. We're currently experiencing, significant strikes throughout the public sector. As it stands, existing departmental budgets for 23-24 are allowing for up to a 3.5% rise, but Treasury reports indicate that's likely to be increased to about 5% across the board, and perhaps even backdated. Finally, I imagine we'll hear more about trying to get people back into work. At the moment, there's over 6 million people unemployed, but not looking for work in the UK. So the government will be trying to reduce this and its impact on limiting growth in the UK, but also the impact it has on causing inflation as well. So just onto more things that we do actually know that have been announced. So beginning with limited companies, from April this year, the corporation tax rate will rise to a maximum of 25%. So for companies that make a profit of over £250,000, all of their profits will be taxed at 25%. For those with profits below £50,000, it's at 19%. And if you make a profit somewhere in the middle, you'll be on a tapered scale to make your overall effective rate of tax somewhere in between there, depending on where you sit on that scale. The annual investment allowance is to remain at £1 million permanently, rather than reverting back to £250,000 from April 2023. This is really good news for agriculture in particular, and actually allows investment in plant and machinery at a time that's best suited to the business, rather than just for tax purposes. The super deduction of 130% on new plant machinery is coming to an end from April 2021. In reality, that's something that the government introduced once they announced the increase in corporation tax rate, to allow companies to save tax at that effective 25% tax rate now, rather than discouraging companies to invest. Not so much changes on the personal tax side as much as freezes, creating really what's known as stealth taxes. So as inflationary pressures lead to a rise in incomes, people end up paying more tax for doing the same job. That's amplified at the moment through the income tax personal allowance continuing to stay frozen until 2028, rather than increasing in line with inflation or increasing by any other measure. The Scottish starter, basic and intermediate rate bands for income tax are to freeze. The top rate threshold has been reduced to £125,000, which wasn't unexpected. What it does mean is that Scotland's becoming a perhaps increasingly increasingly hostile place for high earners compared to the rest of the UK. People in Scotland now pay higher rate tax from 43,500 roughly at 42% from April, compared to at over 50,000 in the rest of the UK at 40%. So there's significant differences are starting to appear there. Something that will affect a lot of us here is the cut to the capital gains tax allowance and the dividend allowance. So those are being cut in half in April, and then by half again the following April. So the capital gains tax allowance will go from just over £12,000 down to £3,000 next April, and dividends from £2,000 down to £500 by next April. The state pension's also going to go up with the inflation rate of 10.1% from this April, with the reinstatement of the triple lock, which is the highest of 2.5% inflation to September, which was the 10.1 or average earnings. But just a few things to note there. Another key point I wanted to talk about this evening is energy support in both domestic and commercial settings. Reduction in wholesale prices mean that the expected strain of support on the UK Treasury is likely to be much less than previously forecast. So the starting point here is really the Ofgem price cap. So that is something that was introduced back in 2019 by Ofgem, and it's revised every 3 months. And that is separate from the energy price guarantee, which has been brought in by the UK government. So the Ofgem price cap caps what suppliers can actually charge customers for energy based on a unit price, based on a typical household. So at the moment, that cap is at over £4,000. So I think it's £4,280, around that mark. However, the government has introduced the energy price guarantee. It's like the Ofgem cap, but it's at a lower rate. The way it works is that the government subsidises energy companies for the difference between that Ofgem cap and the government cap. So that current price cap is at £2,500, and that's what we hear about in the news quite a lot. The plan for that price cap was to rise to £3,000 from April in the new tax year. However, it's widely expected that that cap will be maintained at £2,500 at least for another 3 months to July, at which point Ofgem's own price cap is expected to fall to £2,200, which would be lower than the government support cap. So looking now at businesses, relief takes a slightly different form. So instead of capping what suppliers charge customers, the government support discounts the rate that suppliers pay to generators for wholesale energy. Suppliers then pass on these savings directly through the rates that they charge customers. So the Energy Bill Relief Scheme was introduced, and that runs to March 2023. And this automatically discounts bills for that 6 month period from October 22 to March 23. There is some conditionality attached to this, which is on the screen, which talks about those who are on fixed contracts that started after the 1st of December 21, those who are out of contract or on variable rate contracts. So it means that if your supplier is paying more for their wholesale purchase of energy than the rates approved by government, which is £211 per megawatt hour for electric and 75 for gas, those discounts are then, so the government will then subsidise the difference, and those discounts are passed on directly, so you don't actually see it on your bill. Support has been extended for another year through the Energy Bill Discount Scheme rather than Relief Scheme. It will work in the same way as the Relief Scheme, but will be based on a higher approved wholesale price. However, providing that prices stay below these amounts, no relief is therefore really given. Just one thing to note on this, because this is an area I do get asked about a lot. It doesn't mean that these prices are the prices that you will pay, but it's what your supplier buys it for. Their other charges will remain on top, but it does limit the impact of wholesale energy market prices on the supplier and therefore knocking onto your business. So just to talk about interest rates for a couple of minutes as well, market trends show that there's likely going to be long-term stability around this. So analysis suggests that interest rates are likely going to hit 4.5% in the next 6 months. So that's probably going to be a 0.25% increase now in March, followed by another one of 0.25 in May. The Monetary Policy Committee's own outlook guidance now suggests that interest rates are likely to steady out at that point before falling to around 3% in the medium term. What I've done on this slide is just pull together a table, which is on the screen, to help demonstrate what interest rate rises mean on the ground. So this is just an example of taking a £200,000 loan out being repaid over 20 years. So actually, assuming that the interest rate that you pay on your loan is at least 3% above base, the average annual interest you would pay over that 20 years would be £8,600. However, if you were able to get a loan at 2% less than this, it would make a saving every year of £2,768 on interest alone. Interest rates are to rise a little bit further, but they will level out in the medium term. So just for your own reference, if you were to look to get a loan today, a variable rate loan would likely cost you about 3% over base. If you were to look at a fixed rate loan, a 10-year loan is probably something around 4% over the base rate. 3-year loan is probably around 4.5% or slightly above over the base rate. And if you were to go really far into the distance for 30 years, it'd be around 3.5, 3.6%, but obviously that's very long term. So if you're considering short-term lending, oddly, it's probably worth considering variable rate loans at the moment, but it's worth seeking a bit more advice for your own scenario if that's your case. Yeah, just a few points on the screen on the difference between fixed rate loans and variable rate loans. One other thing to note about fixed rate loans is early repayment charges. If you take out a fixed rate loan and you want to pay that off early, there may be breakage costs or fees, whereas quite often with variable rate loans, there's much more flexibility as to how and when you could pay that off if that's what you need to do. To put my accounting hat on, there's a couple of quick points I thought were worth highlighting to you. The first is around income tax basis period reform. HMRC are mandating that unincorporated businesses will, from April 24, report their profits and pay their taxes on the fiscal tax year rather than on the accounting year. In a lot of cases where clients have a 31st of March or 5th of April year end, this won't make any difference, but it will impact those for whatever reason have their accounting year end at another point. Where that's the case, 2023, 2024 will be used as a transition period, which may be longer than 12 months. So going forward, just as an example, if you have an accounting year end of the 30th of September, that would mean if you wanted to stick with that year end, rather than changing to the 31st of March or the 5th of April, the tax year would cover two periods. Firstly, it would cover the period from the 6th of April to the 30th of September. Secondly, it would then cover the unknown, starting on the 1st of October, going forward to the 5th of April the next year. That means that tax would be paid on 6 months of actual figures, but also 6 months of predicted profits, which would mean adjustments to that figure the next time round when your actual profits are known. Depending on your current year end, this first year may see a period longer than 12 months for tax purposes, but please just speak to your accountants or your advisors on this. It's just to highlight the point and the potential impact that it might have. Finally, just wanted to talk about making tax digital for income tax as well. So we're all aware of making tax digital for VAT, which all VAT registered businesses should now have gone through. That was just the first step on HMRC's path to digitising UK taxes. So one of the next steps in that chain is the move to making tax digital for income tax. This was something which was meant to come into force in April 24, but it's already starting with individuals. But in December, HMRC announced delays, which means it won't start till at least 2026. This will apply to all unincorporated trading businesses, regardless of whether they're VAT registered or not. Where it's likely to cause a bigger change is perhaps for diversification projects or other businesses you hold, such as furnished holiday lets, which are not VAT registered and therefore may not already be on suitable software packages. In practice, it means that the businesses will need to file quarterly returns with HMRC with details of their income and expenditure, along with any other information HMRC specify. And then a final end of year period statement would be submitted after the tax year to complete your tax affairs. So where's all this leading? Although the frequency of reporting is to change under MTD for income tax, and the reporting period will be dictated by basis period reform, the actual timing of tax payments won't change, and the current system of payments on account and balancing payments by 31st of January, which is in place at the moment, is expected to remain there for the foreseeable future. Ultimately, the government's seeking a strategy of tax simplification, but in the short term, it seems far from the case. Keeping on top of your figures is really just going to be key going forward. So to sort of wrap this all up, there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, but equally there's a lot of people in a good financial position now, and you just need to be aware of what's coming. So what can you do here really? Planning ahead. Creating a budget is the best advice I can give anybody who comes to me speaking about these sorts of things. It doesn't need to be complicated. Just start with the status quo of what you have. Try adding on increased costs. Try increasing other costs such as interest rates to see what that means for your business. Knowing in advance of the pinch points will make your bank manager a lot easier to deal with. Also, don't just create a plan, but revise it. Nothing in life is certain, but you can be pretty certain that your plan's not going to match reality. So are you in line with your plan? Are you 5 or 10% out? Are you 50% out? Revising your cash flows to include actual performance will make it a lot stronger, and you'll have a much better grasp of what's going on there. Looking at profitability as well. I often speak to farmers who have money in the bank, but don't really know where it comes from in their business. Do you know what's making you money? Do you know if the fertilizer you're applying is financially viable in terms of the yield increase that it's bringing? So speaking to your consultant or an accountant for advice if you're unsure, but going from there. So yeah, that wraps up all I had to say. So I'll pass back to Alex now as well.
Thanks, Andrew. That's great stuff. Andrew, you kind of touched on what I think will be the answer to this question a couple of times in your presentation here, but I do have written down here what is the one thing that farmers should be doing to kind of safeguard their business going forward? I mean, do we have any idea what to expect in this new upcoming budget?
Yeah, that's a fair question. In terms of things you should really be keeping an eye on, I suppose, one thing is going to be interest rates and also really energy costs. Interest rates can make a significant difference to businesses, particularly those with high levels of borrowing. Energy costs are another key concern, particularly for many businesses where they use a lot of energy. So whether that's potato cold stores, milking parlours, John mentioned other examples there. And actually the projected drop in wholesale prices is going to be welcome in that. Ultimately, there's only so much we can do. So actually, as I've said, it's really just a case of planning ahead. Even if it doesn't come to pass, businesses who plan ahead perform better than those that don't. If you make it'll make you more proactive to change and will keep you on top of your own figures, which is something which is just really important.
Brilliant, good stuff. Well, thank you, Andrew. We'll hear more from you just at the end.
Thanks very much.
And Davy, are you there?
I am. Yeah. Sorry, apologies.
So, Davy, or first of all, let me introduce you. Professor Davy McCracken, the head of our Hill and Mountain Research Centre at Kirkton Auchentyre. Davy, you, unlike the other two speakers, were not a participant of the Winter Roadshow. However, we felt that some of the feedback we were getting was very clear that farmers did want to hear more about the concepts of high nature value farming, conservation policy, and where things are going. So we thought that it was worthwhile bringing you on tonight. So thank you for being here, and I'll let you introduce yourself and get kicked off.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation, Alex. Can you just confirm that you can see my screen okay?
Yes, yep, can see that fine.
Brilliant, excellent. So, yes, so thank you. So trying to follow Alex's brief over the next sort of 15, 20 minutes. Oops, why is this not moving to one? Sorry. I thought it was worthwhile starting out to say, why are we interested in biodiversity on farmland? Well, first of all, farming occurs in every European country. Over what was the EU 28, farming accounts for about 40%, 176 million hectares of the sort of terrestrial land area. Here in Scotland, it's nearly between 75 and 80%. So farming is a major land use across Europe. But just as importantly, from a biodiversity perspective, there's a wide range of habitats and landscapes out there where the nature conservation value is intimately associated with farming practices. It's been created by the farming practices over hundreds of years. It needs to be maintained by the farming practices. So when many people talk about farming and improving biodiversity, there's a misconception that actually the best way to improve biodiversity on farmland is to take land out of agricultural production completely. It's not that at all. Hopefully you'll get a feel for that as we go through the presentation. It's about getting the type of management and the intensity of the management practices more appropriate to actually maintain the biodiversity value that either is or could be there. And again, I was asked to talk about high nature value farming. So again, this misconception that all agriculture across Europe has no interest from a biodiversity perspective is false. The high nature value farming concept was developed from the point of view that currently across Europe, across Scotland and the UK, there's a wide range of farming systems where the habitats that are considered to be of high nature conservation value are also an integral part of the farming system. They're a key forage or fodder resource for that farm. They're not just remnants sitting to the left or right of the actual productive farmland. They are the farmland itself. And so in Northern Europe, a high proportion of the existing high nature value farming systems are livestock based and grazing a wide range and maintaining a wide range of semi-natural habitats. If you go down to Southern Europe and the Mediterranean, there's also a range of more arable based high nature value farming systems that are either arable based or permanent crops like olives, orchards, etc. But in Northern Europe, what we're talking about in high nature value farming in Scotland is primarily now livestock based, and I'll touch a bit on why that is again as we go through the presentation. But it's also worthwhile highlighting that across Europe, that type of high nature value farmland is still about 30% of the EU farmland, and estimates that have been made by Scottish Government here in Scotland is that it's still something between sort of 40 to 44, 45% of our agricultural land use. So there are still systems out there that are actually delivering for biodiversity as well as producing agricultural products. The issue has been, though, that over the last 50 years, there's been some marked changes to agricultural practices and agricultural landscapes. So in the 1960s, when I was born, this book came out, which was highlighting the unintended and indirect effects of the type of pesticides that were being used on farmland and other areas across the globe. Now we have fixed that issue largely. The pesticides that are now in use across Scotland, UK and wider Europe are now much more targeted at that particular group, whether it's plants or insects. Nevertheless, there are still some pesticides like neonicotinoids where there is an adverse impact on things like bumblebees. But in general, we're not talking about a 1960s level of the use of pesticides actually decimating wildlife anymore. What we do have, though, is a situation, this was one of a number of books that came out in the 1980s when I was at university, that what was highlighting that actually we have lost a lot of what was previously agricultural habitats and part of the agricultural landscape over the last 30, 40, 50 years. And that's had a knock-on impact on the biodiversity associated with farms, because these habitats, previously agricultural valued habitats, have been lost from that sort of landscape. And so over much of Europe, the UK and Scotland, it's been the intensification of management practices over that sort of 40, 50 year period that has primarily sort of reduce the sort of biodiversity of a large proportion of our farmland. In some parts of Europe, less in the UK and certainly less in Scotland to date, it's also been the abandonment of management practices in the more remote and mountainous areas, but again, have also had a knock-on impact. But whether it's intensification or whether it's abandonment of management, it's actually both lead to the simplification of agricultural landscapes, and that is what leads to a knock-on effect on the range of wildlife that can actually live and subsist on those farms and in those landscapes. And just to illustrate things here in Scotland, then the figure on the right-hand side there is data from Nature Scotland, British Trust for Ornithology, looking at birds, because we've got a good idea of bird populations in Scotland since the mid-1990s, in the wider UK since the early 1970s. The orange figure in the orange line in the middle of the graphic there, going from 94 to 2019, is a group of about 27 farmland bird species. And overall, you could see that the size of the population in 1994 was set as 100 in this index. And then they've tracked how the population has changed from year to year since then. And when you look at that grouping as a whole of farmland birds, you can see that farmland birds have maintained relatively steady over that 25, 26-year period, whereas upland birds, the species as a whole, have actually declined. But actually, when you drill into the detail of how individual birds within these groupings are faring, then you find like a bird like the kestrel, which was a common or garden bird when I was a lad growing up in Ayrshire, farm in Ayrshire, they've declined by over 82% or over 80% in that 25-year period. And birds like lapwing and waders like oyster catcher have also declined by a huge amount. And when we look at our uplands, then birds like black grouse and curlew have also declined markedly as well. And that is what's highlighting the fact, or behind the fact that we talk about having a biodiversity crisis, not just in Scotland or wider UK, but similar figures, similar crashes in biodiversity have been happening all over the globe. But even looking at the UK side of things, we know a lot about birds, but when you look at things like butterflies, moths, and the bees that I highlighted earlier, in general, though they have been adversely impacted and their populations have declined markedly over the last 40 or 50 years. And on top of that, it's been mentioned earlier, we have ongoing climate change. You may not be familiar with this sort of graphic. Basically, every column is 1 year, stretching from the late 1880s on the left-hand side through to 2018, I think it was, or 2019 on the right-hand side. And basically the colour indicates the average temperature within that year compared to the long-term average. And so the redder the temperature, the redder the column is, the higher the average temperature has been in that year compared to the long-term average. And from, this is for Scotland, and from the mid-1990s, you can see that we have been in an increasing area of climate change, or period of climate change, where temperatures as a whole have been much higher than we've seen in preceding 100 years. So we are in a climate crisis as well as a biodiversity crisis. We're doing a lot of work up at the research farms at Kirkton Auchentyre near Cree and Lara, looking at how you can actually make changes to your actual farming system or farming practices to actually help mitigate climate change. But if farms across Scotland are going to help the Scottish Government meet their net zero target by 2045, dealing with agricultural practices will get Scotland some way towards that net zero by 2045. But actually, it's only going to be doing things like biodiversity management, peatland restoration, wetland creation, woodland creation. Those are the things that will really drive moving the envelope to allow us to get to that net zero target, which is only 22 years away from now. So what does that mean for Scotland? The map on the left is highlighting that sort of over 70% of Scotland is upland or of upland character, and sort of in my screen it's purpley orange, the rough grazing areas. Only about 10% of our agricultural land in Scotland is capable of good quality arable production. Around 20% of our agricultural land is capable of good quality lowland grassland production. But for those lowland systems, arable systems, grassland systems, and for in-by fields in upland areas, what we're talking about is the need to actually replace, put back some of the sort of the habitats and the management of those habitats that have been lost over the last 40, 50 years. Whereas up above the hill dike, then it's a combination of either maintaining existing practices or increasingly looking to restore practices, grazing practices and other management that's required to actually maintain and or increase the sort of biodiversity. The forestry figure down on the right-hand side there is just to remind me, you know, going forward, there's a big question about what role does integrating woodland play in helping farmland of all types improve biodiversity, and I'll make a mention of that towards the end. Alex also asked me to speak about the Scottish Government policy. Scottish Government have stated that they want to change the agricultural support policy in a way that ensures that Scotland becomes a global leader in sustainable and what's called regenerative agriculture. And they stated that back in autumn 2021. And there's a bit of a question mark as to what Scottish Government think is regenerative agriculture and what is regenerative agriculture in practice, and what farmers and other land managers view regenerative agriculture as being. I do a column every month roughly in the Press and Journal. I did this column just over a year ago, where I was highlighting that speaking to some individuals in industry, if they're livestock farmers, they think simply switching to rotational grazing, or if they're arable farmers switching to minimum tillage, they would see that as being regenerative. But actually, proper regenerative farming is more of a more marked change to the overall sort of system of management. Looking at these aspects that are important parts of it, but also looking at, you know, what are your inputs? How can you recycle nutrients on the farm? How can you reduce your input costs and your inputs coming in externally, etc., etc. So regenerative farming is much more of a bigger system change. And in fact, it's only one example of what's called agroecological farming sort of practices or farming systems. And I was making the point, regenerative agriculture, regenerative farming is great if we can achieve it, but that will mean a big change to a large number of the farms in Scotland, certainly a big change away from the current practices. And I also wanted to make the point that I made earlier on, that we still have high nature value farming systems in some parts of our uplands, and we need to ensure that policy going forward recognises that they still exist and actually values the fact that they still exist, and we don't have any unintended consequences of adversely impacting high nature value farming, because we're focusing purely on a regenerative sort of focus over agriculture in Scotland as a whole. Most of you are hopefully familiar with this in terms of how agricultural policy has been developing over the last few years, and it's developed quite quickly in terms of a change in emphasis. We had a stability and simplicity sort of focus not that long ago, but because of the climate and biodiversity emergencies and because of Brexit, we've seen a marked change in Scottish Government aspirations. We've had a wide range of farmer-led groups looking at different aspects of the farming sector and providing advice into Scottish Government. And we currently have I need to look at the slide every time to be able to say it properly, the Agricultural Reform Implementation Oversight Board, which the sharp-eyed of you will see from the citation I've got at the bottom there. That's been going since 2021, and we're still a bit of a ways off in terms of getting a lot of the detail. I think Andrew mentioned the agricultural bill in consultation. There's not an awful lot of detail in there, but the direction of travel is clear. This is illustrative, it's not definitive. This is not coming from Scottish Government. This is coming from some colleagues in SRUC, simply to actually highlight what they would be suggesting, the type of framework we would actually need going forward. Scottish Government has indicated they will continue to provide direct support, direct income support to Scottish farmers, but they're going to put more environmental conditionality on that. But there's a whole range from a biodiversity perspective. We might put some biodiversity conditions on that support, but we'll still need a targeted agri-environment type scheme of some sort going forward to deal with some of the harder to reach management changes that we would need to actually see on the ground in many farms across Scotland. And for the last year, if not 18 months, a lot of the discussion within ARIOB and within groups feeding into ARIOB have been about what would those conditions be that are put on farmers. How can they be fair? How can they be monitored? How can they be seen to be proportionate to what's being asked of farmers? And how might they or might not evolve over time? And in more recent months, there's been a focus also on the current less favoured area support scheme and what may, how that may be included in the agricultural support framework going forward. But we've no definitive details as yet, but there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, and I would hope that more of the detail will be revealed by Scottish Government to farmers and land managers much sooner rather than later, because it's that level of detail that is needed if, as Andrew was saying, you're going to be actually trying to plan for the future and certainly plan for any changes, either any changes in support packages or any additional conditions you'll have to conform to in order to continue to be eligible for those support packages. So, agricultural policy is changing, and so from a Scottish agricultural perspective, then that's all right then. Well, not really at the moment. Those of you who are looking at the biodiversity story within Scotland, within the wider UK, will be well aware that sort of rewilding is a phrase that's bandied about an awful lot in those sort of discussions. That's primarily because many people within conservation, within environmental movement, have lost patience with trying to actually improve biodiversity through normal agricultural support channels. But it's important to emphasise that, again, there can be a misconception there that rewilding is something that's going to be detrimental to farming. The rewilding groups themselves recognise that rewilding is not just one thing. It's not just large carnivores and lots more trees in any part of the globe. It's actually what they call a continuum, and certainly within that red box, which covers most agricultural landscapes in both lowland and upland within Scotland, I would be suggesting, I do suggest regularly, that rewilding doesn't need to mean major changes to existing farm systems in Scotland. So more minor changes could be feasible and still have a disproportionate benefit for biodiversity to those. So I don't see rewilding as a major threat to Scottish agriculture going forward. I see Scottish agriculture being able to actually do things that could be framed as rewilding, still maintaining agricultural production and still helping to actually benefit biodiversity. So what do I mean by that in practice? I'm not going to read all of these again. This is not Scottish Government policy. This was just something I've been feeding in, thoughts I've been feeding into Scottish Government about what type of biodiversity conditions could be put on support payments going forward, going from the bottom of the low ground arable and dairy type systems and as you move further up the hill. But things like retaining, managing existing hedges more appropriately, establishing margins next to them, managing ditches well, where you've got semi-natural habitats below the hill dike, and managing those well, and protecting scrub of conservation value. There's a range of things out there that's potentially feasible to actually introduce from a biodiversity condition perspective, but are also proportionate to introduce, i.e. they're not going to involve an individual farmer or land manager in a EECS type agri-environment type high amount of capital involvement, but nevertheless they might be easy to implement, but they could have a disproportionate benefit to biodiversity, especially if more than one farm in the neighbourhood is doing many of these things. It's a landscape scale benefit we need to actually see going forward if we want to see some of the biodiversity declines actually reduced. And what does that mean that we're doing up at Kirkton Auchentyre? Again, we're an upland research and demonstration farm. We're not reintroducing lynxes in order to rewild. We have planted more trees on the farm, montane woodland, established on the farm about 24 years ago. We're actually integrating more trees in the form of shelter belts, in the form of single trees, in the form of trees within some of our fields, quite successfully, without actually interfering with agricultural production. In fact, we ultimately, when those trees are a bit more established, will benefit the agricultural production. We have done a lot of peatland restoration on the upper part of the farms. Peatland restoration, those farmers and land managers that have degraded peatland on their farm, and that's about 80% of the peatlands across Scotland, is currently degraded. There's a quick win, a big win to be made by actually engaging in peatland restoration actions, which will not only help climate change mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, but when done properly, will recreate peatlands as a wetland habitat and actually benefit biodiversity as well. And one of the most simple things we've done on the farm that's had an almost immediate biodiversity benefit is actually putting fencing off narrow strips either side of our burns and watercourses on the farm, letting the actual vegetation that is there actually come to full floristic richness during the summer. Huge benefits for insects and associated bird species feeding on those insects. Again, at little direct impact to the low ground part of the farm itself. And as I said earlier on, Scotland has very ambitious woodland creation targets going forward, but there is still a question mark over not so much how do you integrate more woodland onto farms. We're confident that can be done in the vast majority of farms, but how Scottish Government will actually support and incentivise that going forward to ensure we see the range of sizes and types of woodland that could be beneficial to biodiversity actually being part of the wider scenario and range of support that's currently being provided for that. And just to finish off, biodiversity management, as I said, there's some farms in Scotland still doing that through their existing systems, and it's trying to maintain and support that going forward. But it's also recognised that biodiversity management on the vast majority of Scottish farmland is not something that the vast majority of farmers are going to find easy or beneficial just to actually do. How does any one individual identify what is most relevant and most beneficial from a biodiversity perspective to do on their own farm? He or she needs guidance, needs advice, needs assistance to actually do that. And it's great that here in Scotland we have what's called the Knowledge Transfer Innovation Fund, and there's currently at least one active KTIF project looking at agroecology and how you can actually enable that transition going forward. It's great that that's actually happening, but what we need is we need more of those. We only need to look at the Republic of Ireland, where they have actively used what's called operation groups, farmer-led groups that are being facilitated and helped to actually identify solutions to particular land management issues. Not all of these groups are focused purely on biodiversity, but a lot of them have been. And it's only through bringing farmers together to identify the problems they are actually having that will make any real change in land management practices in Scotland, irrespective of what the policy is saying. We need some of this underpinning help, assistance, guidance and training to go alongside that to allow farmers to identify what's best to do where and at what scale. If any of you are interested, I believe the slides will be shared afterwards. Then there's links there to more detail about some of the things we've been doing on the farm at Kirkton Auchentyre, near Creanlana, and I'm contractually obliged to at least show you this slide that highlights where some of our funding is coming from for our agriculture and our environmental research. Being Lara. That is all I had for this evening, Alex. I think I've stopped my sharing and come back to yourself. So
That's great. No, thanks very much, Davy. Just another opportunity there for anybody who does want to get in touch with Davy. His email address is available on the screen now. Thanks very much, Davy. That was really good, and I wish it was something that we could have incorporated into the series in its inception. But presumably you're quite pleased that the feedback has been that farmers want to engage more with this topic.
yes, no, definitely. I mean, and people like me can say and highlight what has happened to biodiversity on Scottish farmland or wider European farmland. But we're not the ones that are going to be managing that full extent of farmland. It comes down to farmers and land managers. And while the agri-environment type approach that we've had to date can nudge some farmers more than others towards some sort of direction, agri-environment has been very scattergun. Not enough people have been able to get into it, even if they have been interested in getting into it. And so there hasn't been the scale of actions. Many of the actions that individuals are doing under an agri-environment type scheme are beneficial to biodiversity. They can be beneficial to biodiversity on their individual farm, but actually not enough of them are doing it surrounding that farm in order to get the sort of the scale of benefit that we actually need. But what I think's also needed is farmers being able to realise that actually managing biodiversity can actually be beneficial to their individual farming system. You said earlier in the presentations, I think it was just before Andrew's presentation, you used a phrase that I have heard before: you can't be green if you're in the red. And I've heard that plenty of times before. My answer to that is, but you need to understand why you're in the red in the first place, and what might be the solutions to actually helping you get out of the red and into the green. And some environmental management on the farm might be able to actually help you doing that. Not biodiversity, but actually looking, it would be mention of looking at your soil nutrient status and is it justifiable to actually put the level of fertilizer that you've been buying on, i.e. are they being effective or not? But also increasingly with climate change, could some of these habitats that previously existed on farms or currently still existed, could it be managed a bit better, could it be put back, that would actually be beneficial to the farm in terms of shelter, shade to crops and livestock going forward, or we're increasingly seeing drought conditions or drought-like conditions over large parts of Scotland. Some of the sort of the wetlands that could be created to actually hold water on farms could be beneficial from the farming system point of view. Will also be beneficial from the biodiversity perspective. So I would increasingly urge farmers to look at what the challenges are on their farm from a productive perspective, and consider or seek guidance, seek advice. Actually, how could some of those challenges be actually met by actually doing more for biodiversity on the farm, but also having the added bonus of actually benefiting the farming system themselves and ultimately the economic viability of the farm.
That's great, Davy. Sorry, I'm going to cheat here. That wasn't actually the official question. That was just for my own interest. So the question that we've got lined up for you, Davy, is, and I don't know what the questioner was thinking at the time, but it could be that this is a mention to the rewilding process. It could be that this is somebody who's concerned about conservation policy coming down the line. But how do farmers get to grips with the nature narrative of their farms, and how can we show ownership of that?
Well, it partly in that question, the response I gave earlier to the sort of the you can't be green unless you're in the red. It's actually understanding what's currently on the farm, potentially of biodiversity value, and what could be done to actually improve that biodiversity value, and what the knock-on implications would that be? Would that be positive or negative for the farming system? But then also taking a step back and thinking, well, what else could go on in the farm that would have both biodiversity benefits and benefits to the farm overall? I think only once farmers and land managers see that there are benefits not just to wider society by improving biodiversity on their farms or crops, but also benefits to their individual farms or crops to improving biodiversity. Are we really going to get farmers and croppers feeling that they are owning what they're doing on the farm rather than something being superimposed upon them?
Brilliant. No, that's great. Davy, well, once again, thanks very much for your presentation. Really good stuff. I'm just going to draw the webinar to a close this evening. Can I ask Andrew and John to come back on? Andrew, John, Davy, thanks very much for your participation, both tonight and across the Winter Roadshow. I hope that any clients, any farmers out there who came and saw us at the meetings have also taken something from tonight. It's really good to demonstrate to Scottish Government and other parties that, farming for a better climate and farmers are prepared to take on the issues of climate change and biodiversity decline. And that we can all be part of a constructive narrative, if you like. This recording will be made available on the Farming for a Better Climate website following the event tonight, and copies of any presentations will also be made available there. We've also had some really good questions coming in, so we'll follow up with the individual speakers regarding which topics are most relevant to them. But on behalf of Farming for a Better Climate, thank you and good night.
Thank you.
More than welcome, folks. Good to speak to you.